Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi once again with Sqn Ldr Vijainder Thakur, who's going to help us understand something that came out about a week ago. The ISRO chief came out and said, we need 50 spy satellites. Fair enough. Okay, we've been launching satellites before. But 50? What are they needed for? What is the use? What are we looking at doing? And what is the capability that we are trying to expand? So let's try and understand from Sir as to what the story is and where do we envisage this whole satellite game going. Namaskar, sir. Thank you so much once again for joining me. The last show was very informative, sir. Looking forward for another one.
Okay. Namaskar and Jai Hind, Adi. Delighted to be on your show. And you raised in the introduction, you raised some very good points, and I'd like to start from there. When the ISRO made the statement at the Tech Fest in Mumbai, I think in December, end of December, I also wondered, what is he talking about? We have been launching satellites since a long time. Since I think we started launching, starting with the Aryabhat, which was not launched by India. We had cameras in that satellite which could take pictures of our the country landmass as well as the surrounding landmass. And then we went on to the IRS series. IRS stands for Indian Remote Sensing Satellites. We had a um, I don't remember the exact number, but the satellite series continued for a long time. It might still be continuing. I'm not very sure. Then we had the Cartosat series. Cartosat series, they added multispectral um, film imaging to what was earlier monochromatic or panchromatic imaging, giving the satellite more capability. Cartosat satellites had a dual role. They had good resolution, which was good for the military as well as because of the multispectral imaging, they could look at the resources of the landmass resources, water bodies, etc. So there was Cartosat series. Then we went on. We tried with pure spy satellites. The test was the first one launched in 2001. We progressed on to ResourceSat. ResourceSat was more civil application. What happened was, like, from panchromatic, which is shades of gray, you went on to multispectral, where you have different bands, green, red bands, and blue. You take pictures in that, and you are able to make out not only you're able to see what is on the surface, but you're also able to discern what is it that you're seeing. For example, is it vegetation, or is it the ground, or is it rocks? Because the reflections vary from the object that is reflecting the light. So you had the added ability in this. So resource sites were more or less civil satellites, but I'm referring to them because they are going to become military satellites now. I think the ISRO plans to add in future satellites. They plan to add synthetic aperture radar imaging also, which is more military function. We will talk a little more about the difference between panchromatic, uh, multispectral, hyperspectral. That's the next level of satellites. We ISRO launched what is called the HISIS satellite, hyperspectral imaging satellite. Uh, Now, multispectral and hyperspectral allow you to, besides other things, they allow you to look through clouds to a certain extent. So, if the area that you're trying to film is fogged out, multispectral will still see through it. Multispectral or hyperspectral will also beat any camouflage. If you cover a tank with leaves, the reflection of the tank, it's metal, right? The reflection of the metal, IR reflections too of the metal are going to be very different from infrared reflection of vegetation. So your satellite can discern this is a tank, and not a this thing, pile of vegetation or foliage. So those kind of capabilities were built in, and then we did like initially all our satellites, all ISRO satellites were put into what is called a sun synchronous low Earth orbit. These are typically orbits in the region of about 500 to 700 kilometers, and they are polar orbits. So the satellite roughly revolves, like goes over the two poles, but it can be inclined. The advantage of polar orbits is that you revisit a certain area after a few days, and you're seeing the area in similar light always. So those are some of the advantages. Most spy satellites tend to adopt a polar orbit, or it's also called a
Hmm.
sun synchronous orbit. Like TESS wasn't a polar satellite, and then there is Microsat R. If you remember, this was launched. Basically, the satellite was launched to test our anti-satellite weapon. So it was the ISRO launched it strapped to the outside of a launcher, and then it was released. It operated at, I think, around 250 kilometers, and then it was a proof of concept that you could operate a satellite at a lower altitude and take sharper pictures. And then, of course, they shot it out of the orbit to prove the anti-satellite weapon. So
Yeah.
the one of the problems, generally speaking, like to maintain station, a satellite requires to maneuver periodically because it is drifting off its orbit. So it will use its fuel to stay in its orbit. Typically, polar satellites would last, say, 5, 7. There have been some, I think, like the RISAT, which have lasted almost 20 years, or maybe less,
Hmm.
about 15 years. So sometimes they do better. But these low Earth orbiting, like which are not in polar orbit, satellites like the TESS and Microsat are, they have to maneuver. They are also facing atmospheric drag, or their orbits tend to decay. They need more fuel. Typically, their life is just for 2 to 3 years. So those are the pros and cons. So we have all that, right? So ISRO is filming our territory, our borders, the region surrounding us, at with different technologies: panchromatic, multispectral, hyperspectral, and radar imaging. I forgot about the radar imaging. The
Hmm.
RISAT satellites, they're called. Um, in a radar imaging satellite, you have a synthetic aperture radar, and using the radar as a camera, you don't care if it's night or if it is thick fog. The hyperspectral and multispectral will not work through thick clouds, but uh, SAR on synthetic aperture satellites will work through heavy clouding also and pick up your targets. And they give a very detailed picture. It's as sharp as a panchromatic picture. So we've had that. We have perfected our systems. They're working very well. So you wonder what is the ISRO chief Shri Somnath
Talking
talking
about.
about now, right? Okay, I want to explain that because that is a very important aspect. So, what are we missing and what are we trying to do? Okay, what is missing is our satellites see the target. Well, what happens when you see a target? That picture is downloaded into a satellite control center. It is made available to analysts. Analysts go through the photo, they identify targets of interest, or whatever you want to call it, areas of interest. Whatever is of interest on the surface, they analyze it. Let's say you are in the midst of a war, hostilities. What will happen is you will have a RISAT, synthetic aperture satellite, take a picture. That picture is comes to the analyst. Analyst says, there is a tank over here. We need to get this out of the way.
Something.
So he
Hmm.
sends it to command center. The photograph and the coordinates. The command center will now task a unit. It could be it could be the Air Force unit or Army unit, and say, "Oh, go strike this target. This is over here. We need to get it out of the way." Or they will make the information available to the field units for them to deal with it how this will fit. And then these guys, let's say the Air Force takes it on, Air Force will launch an aircraft, program its weapon systems to launch a missile with the right coordinates, and the aircraft will go there and fire the missile, and hopefully he'll hit the target. Now, that is assuming that it's a static target. So let's just assume that. But a static target, there's a lot of time delay in all this, right? What you need is not just a satellite that takes pictures. Ideally speaking, you need a satellite that is in orbit. It takes a picture and says, "Hey, that's not supposed to be. That's dangerous. It's something that we need to address immediately." It converts the photo image into a targeting coordinate. It
Actionable
relays the
intelligence.
coordinates in real time to the
Mhm.
aircraft, which is airborne, or even a missile, which has been launched. It can do that, because if you convert the information that you have in terms of the image to precise coordinates, and then you can feed the coordinates to a missile that may be airborne, or a aircraft that may be airborne, and you have an immediate response to the threat that you have perceived. So that is what we are nowhere near that as yet. The reason is because now you don't need just a camera or a synthetic aperture radar. You need a lot of processing power. You need a lot of you need to be able to uh, designate a target. Okay, that needs to be hit. So the satellite needs to be much bigger. The cameras need to be much sharper. They're actually you know you go on to they're practically IR telescopes, or big radars which can have great resolution, and you can steer it and point it towards a target and get the accurate coordinates. So that's the level of technology that you need to do. We need that. We need that very urgently to improve our response time to a perceived threat. So that's one. Other than that, there are other things that have military applications. Of course, the ISRO chief called it geointelligence. But geointelligence, there are other aspects to geointelligence. There is this element. You need a satellite that is continuously up in the sky. It's got sensors. It is picking up transmission of each and every adversary radar, analyzing the transmission, determining the frequency, determining how it changes its frequency depending on the modes it has, and providing this a library to the fighters or other weapon systems. Because after all, if a Jaguar is going to go in and attack at low levels, and its radar warning starts to beep, he must know what is triggering the radar warning. No? Is it a missile radar? Has he got a missile lock? Which particular radar is locking on? Is it an airborne radar? So that library, creating library data bank is one such task. Then finding out the source. The radar may have been relocated from its last known position. That it's a task. So you need satellites which are on watch. They're analyzing the electronic signals that are emanating from the surface. We already have this satellite series in operation. uh, I think more launches are planned. So this is another thing, that another facet that will be progressed by ISRO in the next 5 odd years. What ISRO has in mind is, like we were working with satellites, but they're either in polar orbit or they are in
Geosynchronous.
geostationary orbit. Like I coming back to our photo imaging. We mentioned that polar satellites are going around the Earth, and they have a revisit time because the Earth is rotating under the satellite which is orbiting. So if the satellite takes about an hour, let us say theoretically it takes an hour, it takes actually more, say 1 hour 20 minutes or 1 hour 10 minutes. But let's say it takes an hour, then within 24 hours it will come on the same spot, right? But generally it is lesser. Between 15 to 22 days is the time of a revisit. Now you can shorten that time of revisit of your target area by the ability to move your cameras left and right of your
Mm.
tracking your track on the ground. Then you can revisit a little earlier. Say, let's say you can revisit in 3 to 4 days. But what if the requirement is to continuously monitor something that is developing? No? You need continuous, non-stop, 24 hours 7 coverage of an area. So now you have an option. You can put that satellite in a geosynchronous orbit where it is able to maintain continuous watch over a particular area on the ground. The problem with that is a geosynchronous orbit, unlike a polar orbit, which is at 700 kilometers. Geosynchronous is 36,000, I'm not sure miles or kilometers, whatever. It's very, very high, compared to that. So your resolution is not going to be there. The best, I think, we have ISRO has created a series of satellites called GISat, geosynchronous, orbiting satellites. Now these maintain station at in a geostationary orbit. They have more powerful cameras, but the cameras give a lesser resolution. So that becomes a constraining factor.
Hmm.
Now, one of the thing that one of the what ISRO chief probably had in his mind is ISRO is thinking of creating two constellations of these imaging satellites. They want to place one in geosynchronous orbit that is high up with low resolution, and the normal polar satellites to film from close by with much higher resolution. I think if I were to guess, ISRO has achieved resolutions to the tune of about 50 centimeters, resolution. So, which is fairly good. Now, what something that the ISRO has been talking about is that they would, and in fact, Shri Somnath mentioned this. He said we should be able to task a GI sat must be able to task a polar orbiting satellite. Oh, take a look at that point. It's important. There's something coming up over there. So if you
Hmm.
have a constellation, so they now the most military satellites are placed in constellations. So you have a constellation, you create a system may have one or multiple constellations. So you have, let's say you create a system where you have one constellation in polar orbit and one constellation in geosynchronous orbit. Now you're talking business, because the geosynchronous satellite sees something, it tasks a polar satellite which is over the area or which is likely to come over the area within minutes or within an hour to take a
Hmm.
closer look, and then you get immediate information as to what is that about the emerging threat. So I just came back to that. So these are, like, okay, so taking on from here only, you need the ability for this satellite, which is in geosynchronous orbit, to transmit to a polar satellite and say, hey, take this, film this spot, right?
Relay.
You need communication. What if that polar satellite is not in your radio horizon? You need satellites which facilitate communication between satellites. So you have you have communication satellites which facilitate communication between two points on the ground. You also need satellites which facilitate communication between satellites. So we need to create those kind of satellites. So like the new satellites that we have talked about, one is these uh, constellations, layered constellations, and we talked about ELINT. We need more ELINT satellites. Uh, so in addition to that, there are other threats which are not conventional imaging threats. For example, we have two adversaries right across our border. You have China, you have Pakistan. They are both have got very capable missiles, and they are right across the border. It's not like you are in the US, where the US, the it's got a 15 minutes warning time. We don't have that 15 minutes warning time. We can't rely on our radars to pick up a missile launch. It's too late, because the missile will climb up, and once it crosses the radar horizon, you'll spot it, and then calculate the trajectory. You want to spot that missile the moment the motor starts burning, the flash that appears. So you need
Hmm.
satellites which are continuously monitoring a certain area. Now, typically, this is done by, we have talked about polar satellites, we have talked about geosynchronous satellites. There is another category of orbits, satellite orbit, another category of satellite orbit, which is called the high elliptical orbit. It's also called the Molniya orbit after a constellation of Russian satellites, Russian communication satellites. See, Russia is far in the north, so they need to focus on the north of the globe for their communication. So
Mm.
typically, HEO satellites are a cross between polar satellites or low Earth orbiting satellites and geosynchronous satellites. Geosynchronous satellites are over the area 24 hours. Polar satellites revisit after several days. In a highly elliptical orbit satellite, or the Molniya orbit satellite, the the target area remains under watch for a long time, and then the satellite, sorry, yeah, the satellite sort of loops up height, almost to the same height as a geosynchronous satellite, and then comes down and it swings very sharply behind the Earth, where in the part of the Earth where you're not interested in taking any pictures, and then starts going up. So it maintains station for a longer time over a certain target area, and then it revisits very quickly. So now those are the type of satellites you need for maintaining a missile watch, a missile launch watch.
Mm.
Uh, Now these satellites, the high elliptical orbit satellites, give you a scanning ability, but you also need a steering ability. Like once the missile is launched, it doesn't help. Again, what we were saying. Okay, so a missile has been launched. Are you going to transmit the coordinates? It's not going to help. You need to track the trajectory because the anti-ballistic missile now must know precisely where it is going to intercept that missile. For that, you need to track the trajectory, and for that, you have another satellite constellation which is orbiting at very low levels, which can track the plume of the satellite as it goes, as it follows its trajectory. So you have a fair idea of where the satellite is going and when it can be intercepted. Now, these are
Yeah.
very highly specialized satellites, but we need them. We are not secure. Uh, you see what Russia is doing now. They are putting these satellites into orbit because they never thought they would be fighting Ukraine. They had their HEO satellites all monitoring the US, but they ended up fighting Ukraine. So now they have to reorientate their entire satellite constellations and start looking at this area of Ukraine, which is taking a little bit of time. So let's to recap. You have these. We need the ability to be able to see the missiles as soon as they're launched. We need the ability to track the missiles so that we can launch our anti-ballistic missile systems. Of course,
True.
the end game is always radar. So but the radar must know where it must look to engage a missile that is incoming. So you need those. You need ELINT, a missile to keep a continuous track. You need communication satellites to help inter-satellite communication. Considering that the life of a satellite is limited, you can imagine what the ISRO chief is saying is really, it's a very modest figure that he's presenting, that you need to launch 50 satellites, 50 geo-intelligence satellites over the next 5 years plus. I That's in brief what my understanding of what he was saying is. I don't know.
No, sir. I
You
mean, I want you to kind of help us understand the connection between a system like this and Starlink, which is also a gridded satellite system, which
right?
sends
Okay.
in.
Now I have deliberately adapted, not talked about communication satellites.
Okay.
Communication satellites are very much part of the military communication network. But since the ISRO chief specifically referred to geo intelligence satellites, so I have restricted my explanation to geointelligence satellites. It's satellites which are
Sure.
gathering. Yes, we the requirement for communications is there. In fact, a very interesting development. The the Navy GI sat, ISRO planned two GI sat satellites. There was a technical issue, glitch with the first one. This is the satellite that orbits in geosynchronous orbit and maintains a continuous watch over a certain area. But the by this time, the military is hooked onto communication satellites. But the military is also beginning to realize, look, we need much more from ISRO. We don't
We
need,
need it separate. Yeah. Mm.
yeah. So initially, the military was thrilled with the pictures, satellite pictures. Oh my God, such resolution, excellent. But then there is, like we talked about, you have to put that weapon over there, and in a very short time. So they realize that okay, this is the start. We need much more than that. So the second GI satellite, despite the fact that the first one didn't work out, the Navy told ISRO that look, don't just give it to us with optical capabilities, add a synthetic aperture radar also. So it's got delayed. ISRO is now modifying the GI sat to also have a synthetic aperture radar. So from geosynchronous orbit, it will be keeping track of a certain area in all weather conditions now, not just
Mm.
in clear weather. You'll be able to see the demand from the military is increasing, and that is going to happen. It's going to happen as because the military is building up its capabilities to use satellite imagery and seeing the benefits of using satellite imagery. So,
That's one.
as far as the
Please. Sir.
communication satellite is concerned, yes, we need a constellation like what you have. Communication, the new way, if you go by the Ukraine war, is internet, satellite based internet, unjammable. You know, Starlink, you can't jam. It is heavily encrypted. So it gives the ability for everybody to communicate. Like a soldier who's all alone by himself must be able to talk to anybody in the chair of command, right? If a soldier is out in the field and he has no direct communication with anybody, he's all alone. The nearest person to him maybe meters away in a very hostile environment. What does he do? He must be able to communicate with the top echelon. Internet, satellite based internet gives you that capability. He gets all the information. The soldier can be given all the information that he requires. He has the gadgets on him. He gets so to enable the war fighters, you need such a constellation, and it's just a matter of time. Every country is building a constellation similar to Starlink. I mean, different people are adopting different approaches. Like
Mm.
Starlink has got the number of satellites is varying. The US is Amazon has launched Project Kuiper, which
Okay.
uses lesser satellites, but the capability is same. Russia has its own constellation, which is coming up. I'm not very sure about what is the specific European constellation coming up, but they're coming up all around. So communication, satellite, satellite-based internet, you know, that ability is a must for the military today.
Yes, that I mean, the second part of the question is what I wanted to ask you, but I think you've answered it right there. Sir, this is very, very informative. I must say, this is something that we don't find in public domain, and it's important for us to know it. As Indians, we need to know what our scientific community is doing. Plus, as I said in the last episode, I will say it now as well. People who watch this show, if you have any expertise in this particular region, contribute towards the growth of the nation because that is what is needed. We need to do it on our own. You can't piggyback on China or USA or anybody else for that matter. That bhai humko ye de do, humko wo de do and all that will never work. And remember the factor of the Kargil war when the US switched off your GPS systems because they didn't want you to kind of hit back at the Pakistanis the way you were doing at that time. So it's very important that we develop our own systems. Atmanirbharta is the key, and this show will give you insights with sir on to latest military technology that is coming across and its importance to all of us. Thank you so much, sir. Jai Hind, Jai
Jai Hind,
Bharat.
Dadi. Delighted once again and look forward to the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.